I gave my mother my left kidney. The recovery took 8 agonizing weeks of excruciating pain and sleepless nights. But there I was, sitting at our lavish family anniversary dinner, when my father stood up, raised his crystal glass, and announced to the entire room, "To your sister who organized the fundraiser and saved your mother's life." 20 relatives cheered and clinked their glasses together. Not a single person looked at me. I gritted my teeth and started to stand up, ready to scream the truth. But my mother grabbed my wrist, pulling me back down. Her eyes were wet with tears as she slid a crumpled white napkin across the table. Written in frantic, messy handwriting, it read, "We received a report from the hospital. Please do not expose Spencer's fundraiser. Save our family honor." She knew. She had a piece of my actual body inside of her, and she wanted me to stay silent to protect her golden child daughter and her precious white son-in-law. My name is Morgan, and I am 33 years old. If you have ever been sacrificed on the altar of your family's fake reputation, hit that like button and subscribe. Let me know where you are watching from in the comments, because you will definitely want to hear how I decided that this family no longer had any honor left to save. To truly understand the absolute audacity of that napkin, you have to understand the illusion my family sells to the world. We were gathered at an upscale steakhouse downtown to celebrate my parents' 40th wedding anniversary. My father, Malcolm, is an elder at one of the largest, predominantly black churches in Atlanta. He is a man obsessed with image legacy and projecting what he calls black excellence to anyone who will listen. My mother, Brenda, is his perfect counterpart, always dressed in designer suits, serving on countless charity boards and ensuring our family looks flawless to the congregation. Then there is my younger sister, Sydney. At 31, Sydney is the undisputed golden child. She has never held a real job for more than 6 months, but she has thousands of social media followers and a perfectly curated life. 2 years ago, she married Spencer, a white guy, who works in what he vaguely calls cryptocurrency and venture capital. My parents practically worship Spencer. To them, his presence in the family elevated their status. They treated him like a savior long before my mother ever got sick. I am the exact opposite of Sydney. I am a senior audit director for a major health insurance conglomerate. I worked my way up the corporate ladder completely on my own. I own my home, I pay my own bills, and I never ask my parents for a dime. But in my father's eyes, my success means nothing because I am unmarried and independent. To him, I am just the stubborn workaholic daughter who refuses to fall in line. 6 months ago, my mother's kidneys started failing. The doctors told us the waiting list for a deceased donor could take years. Years she did not have. We needed a living donor immediately. Sydney conveniently claimed she was too overwhelmed with her new marriage to undergo the testing. Spencer said his blood type made it impossible without even checking. So I quietly stepped up. I went through weeks of rigorous medical evaluations, psychological screenings, and agonizing physical tests. I was a perfect match. I agreed to do the transplant anonymously because I knew if my parents knew it was me, they would somehow find a way to minimize it or complain that my recovery was inconveniencing them. I just wanted my mother to live. The surgery was brutal. They removed my left kidney through a 6-inch incision that cut through my abdominal muscle. For 2 months, I could barely stand up straight. I managed my painful recovery alone in my apartment while my family posted daily prayers on social media, asking their church community to support my mother's miraculous healing process. And boy, did they ask for support. Back at the anniversary dinner, the private dining room was filled with our extended family church leaders and my parents' affluent friends. The wine was flowing and the tables were covered in expensive steaks and seafood. My father stood at the head of the long table, tapping his spoon against his wineglass to command attention. The room went silent. He puffed out his chest, looking directly at Sydney and Spencer, who were sitting across from me looking smug. "Family," my father bellowed, his voice echoing off the mahogany walls. "Tonight we celebrate not just 40 years of marriage, but a literal miracle from God. When my beautiful Brenda fell ill, we thought all hope was lost. But the Lord works through extraordinary people. He gestured grandly toward my sister and her husband. I want to raise a glass to Sydney and Spencer. Spencer used his brilliant financial mind and corporate connections to ensure Brenda got the best care possible. And our sweet Sydney worked tirelessly day and night to organize a community fundraiser. Thanks to her campaign, they raised $250,000 to cover the overwhelming medical expenses. They are the reason Brenda is sitting here with us today. They are true heroes. The entire room erupted into a standing ovation. People were clapping, wiping tears from their eyes, and raising their glasses toward Sydney and Spencer. I sat frozen in my chair. $250,000. Medical expenses. My mind raced trying to process the sheer magnitude of the lie happening right in front of my face. I shifted in my seat, and a sharp shooting pain radiated from my abdomen. Underneath my tailored red blazer, the heavy surgical dressing covering my 6-inch scar rubbed against the fabric. The wound was still seeping and aching from the surgery I had undergone to save her life. The standing ovation continued around me. People were wiping tears from their eyes and reaching across the table to shake Spencer's hand. My mother sat in her wheelchair at the end of the table, dabbing her eyes with a lace handkerchief. I looked down at the crumpled napkin she had just slid over to me. Save our family honor. The ink was slightly smudged, but the message was crystal clear. She knew. My mother knew exactly whose kidney was currently keeping her alive. The hospital must have sent a post-operative report or a billing statement that accidentally revealed my identity as the donor. But instead of crying tears of gratitude for the daughter who had actually laid on an operating table and been sliced open for her, she was covering it up. She was choosing the lie. She was choosing the image of Black excellence that my father craved so desperately. Sydney and Spencer were the perfect cover story for their wealthy church friends. To my parents, a successful fundraiser led by a white son-in-law and a golden child daughter sounded much better than admitting their unmarried workaholic daughter had quietly saved the day. I looked at my mother and she could not even meet my eyes. She just stared down at her lap, her hands trembling slightly. The sheer audacity of it made my blood boil. I placed my hands on the edge of the heavy mahogany table and pushed myself up. A fresh wave of agony shot through my left side, but I ignored it. I stood there, tall and silent, waiting for the applause to die down. The room slowly went quiet, as people noticed me standing. My father lowered his wine glass, his smile turning into a tight, irritated line. "Morgan," he warned, his voice low and dangerous. "Sit down and let your sister have her moment." I did not sit down. I stared directly across the table at Sydney. She was wearing a designer dress that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage. She leaned back in her chair, twirling a diamond ring on her finger, and let out a dramatic sigh. "Morgan, stop looking so bitter," she said loudly enough for the entire room to hear. The guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The pastor of our church, who was sitting near my father, cleared his throat nervously. Sydney offered me a condescending smile filled with fake pity. "I know you are just an auditor and you do not have much going on in your life right now, but try to smile. Spencer and I raised $250,000 to pay for Mom's surgery. The least you can do is look happy for our family." Spencer wrapped his arm around Sydney's shoulder, giving me a patronizing look. He wore an expensive tailored suit and a smug expression that made my stomach turn. "We are just glad we could step up when the family needed real help, Morgan," he added. "Some of us actually have the resources to make a difference." My father nodded in agreement, beaming at his son-in-law. "That is right, Spencer. You two showed true dedication. Now, Morgan, sit down before you embarrass yourself." I did not scream. I did not cry. Years of sitting in high-pressure corporate audit meetings had taught me exactly how to keep my composure when dealing with liars. I reached into my designer handbag and pulled out my corporate black card. The smooth, heavy metal felt cold against my fingers. I caught the eye of the headwaiter, who was hovering nervously near the back of the private dining room. "Check, please," I said, my voice completely steady. The waiter rushed forward carrying a black leather folder. I knew my father had ordered the most expensive bottles of wine on the menu, along with premium steaks and lobsters for 20 people. The bill was massive, but my father had not reached for his wallet once. He just assumed someone else would cover it like he always did. I opened the folder. The total was exactly $4,000. I placed my black card inside and handed it back to the waiter. Sydney watched me, her smug smile faltering just a fraction. "What are you doing, Morgan?" my mother whispered, her voice laced with panic. The waiter returned a minute later, handing me the receipt to sign. I signed my name carefully, making sure my hand did not shake. I took the customer copy and walked slowly around the large dining table until I was standing directly behind Spencer and Sydney. The entire room watched my every move. I leaned down, ignoring the sharp pull of my stitches, and dropped the $4,000 receipt right onto Spencer's empty dinner plate. "If you and Sydney raised $250,000, I said, my voice carrying clearly across the dead silent room. "Why am I paying for your dinner?" Spencer opened his mouth, but no words came out. His face turned a patchy shade of red. Sydney stared at the receipt as if it had burned her. I looked up at my father, who was gripping the edge of the table, his knuckles white. I looked at my mother, who had buried her face in her hands, unable to witness the confrontation she had begged me to avoid. I made sure every single guest in that room heard my next words. And funny, I thought organ donations were free. Nobody moved. The clinking of glasses and the cheerful chatter had completely vanished. The church elders looked at each other in total confusion. I turned around and walked toward the exit, holding my head high despite the burning pain in my side. I did not look back when I pushed the heavy oak doors open and stepped out of the dining room, leaving my family to suffocate in the dead silence I had created. I pushed through the heavy glass doors of the steakhouse and stepped out into the humid Atlanta night air. The valet was already retrieving my car, but before he could pull up to the curb, I heard the aggressive click of heels hitting the pavement behind me. "Morgan? Wait right there!" Sydney shrieked, her voice echoing across the parking lot. I turned around slowly, resting my hand against my aching side. Sydney was marching toward me with Spencer hot on her heels. His face was twisted in anger, the smug mask completely gone. He closed the distance between us and stepped entirely too close, invading my personal space. "What is your problem?" Spencer demanded, pointing his finger directly in my face. "You just could not let us have one night, could you? You had to ruin a beautiful moment for your parents because you are so incredibly bitter." I stared at his finger and then looked him dead in the eyes. "Put your hand down, Spencer, before I break it." He scoffed, dropping his hand but puffing out his chest. He was trying to physically intimidate me, but I had dealt with men like him in corporate boardrooms for a decade. He possessed that toxic white savior complex, always acting like he was descending from on high to bless our family with his presence. "You are exactly what they say you are," Spencer sneered, leaning in. "Just another angry black woman who cannot stand to see other people happy. You are 33 years old, with no husband, no kids, and nothing to show for your life except a fancy job title. You are jealous that Sydney and I stepped up to save your mother while you sat back and did nothing." The sheer ignorance of his words almost made me laugh. He really believed his own lies. "Jealous of what exactly?" I asked, keeping my voice dangerously calm. "Jealous that my sister is a 31-year-old grown woman who still needs mommy and daddy to fund her lifestyle. Or maybe I am jealous that she married a man who pretends to be a crypto genius but relies on old ladies at a church to pay his bills." Sydney gasped, stepping out from behind Spencer. "How dare you?" she yelled. "We raised that money to save Mom. We did the hard work. You are just mad because Mom and Dad have always loved me more." I looked at my sister, the golden child who had been spoon-fed her entire life. The anger that I had suppressed for over a decade finally boiled over. "They loved you more because you were exactly the kind of helpless victim they needed to feel important," I said, stepping closer to her. "Let us talk about hard work, Sydney. Let us talk about how when you were 20 years old, you racked up $50,000 in credit card debt trying to look rich on Instagram. Do you remember who paid for that? Sydney crossed her arms, looking away, but I was not going to let her escape the truth. Mom and Dad drained my entire college fund to bail you out. I continued, making sure Spencer heard every word. The money they had saved for my education was wired directly to the credit card companies, so their precious golden child would not have to declare bankruptcy. I had to take out $80,000 in student loans just to get my degree at Spelman College. I worked 2 jobs and studied through the night while you were living in a luxury apartment that our parents paid for. Spencer looked momentarily confused, glancing at Sydney, but he quickly recovered his arrogant posture. He was not going to let facts get in the way of his narrative. That is ancient history, he said, dismissing my trauma with a wave of his hand. The point is that we saved Brenda today. We are receiving the Community Pillars Award at the church gala next week because we actually do things for this family. The church gala, the grand event where my parents intended to parade their fake savior son-in-law in front of the entire congregation. You are receiving an award for spending $250,000 of other people's money, I asked, tilting my head. I wonder what the pastor would say if he knew the hospital bill was $0. Spencer's face went rigid. A flash of genuine panic crossed his eyes before his anger returned, doubling in intensity. He took another step toward me, lowering his voice to a threatening whisper. "Listen to me very carefully, Morgan," he said, his tone laced with malice. "You are going to stay far away from that church gala. You are not going to show your face, and you are certainly not going to open your mouth. Do not even think about digging into that GoFundMe money. You do not understand the deals I have in place right now, and I will not let some jealous spinster ruin my reputation." I did not flinch. I just looked at the sweat forming on his forehead. He was terrified. "If you know what is good for you, you will keep quiet," Spencer continued, trying to regain his dominant posture. "Your father already agreed to this. He knows what we did and he supports us. Do not cross your own father, Morgan." That was the final piece of the puzzle. My father knew. He had likely signed off on whatever scam Spencer was running with the church funds. They were all in on it together, sacrificing my body and my truth to protect a web of financial lies. The valet pulled my car up to the curb, leaving the engine running. I turned my back on Spencer and Sydney, opening my car door. "I do not need a husband or kids to have a fulfilling life," I said, looking at them over my shoulder. "And I definitely do not need a family that sells my organs to buy fake prestige. Enjoy your award, Spencer." I slipped into the driver's seat and drove away, leaving them standing in the damp parking lot. The pain in my side throbbed relentlessly, but my mind was completely clear. Spencer had made a fatal mistake. He had told an auditor not to dig into the money. As I navigated the quiet Atlanta streets toward my luxury high-rise apartment, a cold sense of purpose settled over me. They wanted to play games with medical bills and charity funds. They had no idea who they were dealing with. I was the senior audit director for the exact health insurance conglomerate that covered my mother's surgery. My entire career was built on finding missing money and destroying fraudsters. I pulled into my secure parking garage and took the elevator up to my penthouse. I ignored the blinking messages on my phone from my father and walked straight to my home office. I turned on my secure laptop, entering my encryption passwords. The soft glow of the monitor illuminated the dark room. Spencer wanted me to stay away from the GoFundMe money. I smiled, letting my fingers hover over the keyboard. Let us see exactly where that $250,000 really went. Before my fingers could even strike the keyboard, my phone began to vibrate across the glass surface of my desk. The caller ID showed my father's name. He had been calling me relentlessly since I left the steakhouse, but I had ignored every single attempt during my drive back to the penthouse. This time, however, I decided to answer. I needed to hear exactly how far he was willing to go to protect his golden child and his precious son-in-law. I placed the phone on speaker and leaned back in my chair, my eyes never leaving the glow of my computer monitor. "Morgan, what is wrong with you?" My father's voice boomed through the small speaker, filling my quiet office with his misplaced rage. You embarrassed your mother and me in front of the entire congregation. You made a scene at a family celebration just to feed your own ego. I stared at the screen, taking a slow breath. I paid the bill. Dad, I said, my voice flat and emotionless. I paid for a dinner that Spencer and Sydney supposedly had the money to cover. How is that making a scene? Do not play smart with me, Morgan, he snapped. You know exactly what you did. You are deliberately trying to ruin your sister's marriage out of pure spite. You cannot stand the fact that Sydney found a good man who takes care of her. A good man. I repeated the words, tasting like ash in my mouth. Dad, he is using our church to fund his lifestyle, and you are letting him. My father did not even pause to deny it. Spencer brings prestige to this family, he insisted, his voice dripping with that old, familiar disappointment he always reserved just for me. He has connections in the corporate world that we need. He elevates our standing in the community. People look at Sydney and Spencer, and they see success. They see Black excellence merging with generational wealth. What do they see when they look at you, Morgan? I closed my eyes. The throbbing pain in my side, where they had removed my kidney just a few weeks ago, flared up again, reminding me of exactly what I had sacrificed for this family. I pressed my hand against my abdomen, feeling the thick bandages under my shirt. They see an unmarried workaholic who is pushing 35 and has nothing to show for it but a fancy apartment and a bitter attitude. My father continued, twisting the knife exactly where he knew it would hurt the most. You embarrass me, Morgan. You always have to be the difficult one. You always have to challenge the natural order of things. I listened to the man who was supposed to protect me completely tear me down, just to protect a son-in-law who was actively scamming our community. The hypocrisy was suffocating. I forbid you from attending the church gala next week. My father ordered, his tone leaving no room for argument. I will not have you sitting in the pews glaring at your sister while she receives an award she deserves. You will stay in your apartment, and you will keep your mouth shut about the GoFundMe money. If you try to ruin this night for our family, I will personally make sure the church board shuns you. You will be dead to us. A single tear slipped down my cheek. It was an involuntary reflex, a lingering habit from the little girl who just wanted her daddy to be proud of her. But as that tear hit the glass surface of my desk, something inside me permanently clicked into place. The sadness evaporated instantly, replaced by a cold, calculating calm. The tears stopped. I wiped my face and pulled the phone closer to my mouth. I will not be at the gala to embarrass you, Dad, I said softly. Good, he grunted, sounding relieved that his intimidation tactics had worked one more time. See that you stay away. Focus on your audit files and leave the real business to the men in this family. He ended the call. The line went dead. I sat in the silence of my high-tech luxury apartment. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the Atlanta skyline. But I was not looking at the glittering city lights. I was looking at the secure login portal for the largest health insurance conglomerate in the Southeast. My employer, my domain. Leave the real business to the men in this family. Those words echoed in my mind as I placed both hands back on the keyboard. My father and Spencer thought I was just a bean counter, a miserable spinster pushing papers in a cubicle. They had no idea what a senior audit director actually did. They had no idea that my security clearance gave me unrestricted access to the most heavily guarded financial and medical databases in the country. Spencer wanted to play the role of the wealthy white savior. My father wanted to play the role of the prestigious patriarch. And my mother wanted to play the grateful survivor while hiding the daughter who had actually bled to save her life. They had built an entire empire of lies on top of my stolen college fund, my constant humiliation, and my missing left kidney. I cracked my knuckles and began to type. The insurance system accepted my master credentials without hesitation. As the senior director of the auditing division, I had the ultimate authority to pull any file review, any claim, and trace any payment that passed through our massive network. My mother was covered under my personal corporate insurance plan. I had put her on my executive platinum policy the moment her kidneys started failing, ensuring she would get the best possible care without waiting for state funding or dealing with terrible coverage limits. I typed her name into the search bar. Brenda Carter. The system pulled up her extensive medical history in a fraction of a second. I navigated to the billing department and filtered the financial results for the past 3 months. This time frame covered the entire pre-operative testing phase, the transplant surgery itself, and her ongoing post-operative care in the intensive care unit. The progress bar on the screen loaded and a highly detailed invoice appeared before me. It was time to hunt. My eyes scanned the itemized list of medical charges. Room and board for 2 weeks in the specialized transplant ward. The surgical team fees. The specialized anesthesia. The expensive anti-rejection medications she would need for the rest of her life, the daily physical therapy sessions. The total cost of the procedure and the hospital stay was astronomical, totaling hundreds of thousands of dollars, just as Spencer had claimed when he tearfully set up the fundraiser for our church community. But I was not looking at the total cost. I was looking at the patient responsibility column. I was looking at the exact amount of money that my parents or Spencer actually had to pay out of their own pockets to the hospital. I scrolled down to the bottom of the secure page where the final balance was calculated after my platinum corporate insurance had been applied. The numbers stared back at me in stark black and white, confirming every dark suspicion I had ever held about my sister and her husband. I let out a dry, humorless laugh that echoed in the empty room. Spencer and Sydney had stood in front of our entire church congregation, crying and begging for donations. They had convinced elderly widows to give up their pension checks. They had convinced hardworking families to donate their meager savings to cover the overwhelming medical debt that my mother had supposedly incurred. They had raised $250,000 in the name of saving a life. I stared at the screen, burning the undeniable image into my memory. The system did not lie. The corporate audit trail was absolute and permanent. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair and took a deep breath, letting the heavy reality of their crime wash over me. My family had not just betrayed my trust and abused my body. They had completely defrauded our entire community for their own selfish gain, and I was going to burn their fake empire to the ground. The green cursor blinked against the dark background of my auditing software. I stared at the final row of the billing ledger for my mother's kidney transplant. The gross charges were staggering. The surgical suite, the anti-rejection drugs, the week-long stay in the intensive care unit, the specialized nephrology team that monitored her recovery. The grand total was over $600,000, a number that would bankrupt almost any normal family in Atlanta. But we were not a normal family, and I was not a normal employee. I scrolled past the gross charges and looked at the insurance adjustments. Because I was both the living donor and the primary guarantor on the account, my executive platinum health plan kicked in at 100%. There were no deductibles for this specific tier of corporate coverage. There were no hidden copays or out-of-network penalty fees. The hospital had directly billed my employer network, and the network had paid every single penny without a moment of hesitation. I moved my mouse to the final line item on the digital document. Patient responsibility. The numbers sat there mocking the elaborate performance my family had put on at the steakhouse just hours ago. $0.00. The hospital had never sent a medical bill to my parents. They had never asked Spencer or Sydney for a dime. The financial burden of my mother's life-saving surgery had been completely erased the moment I signed the donor consent forms and handed over my insurance card to the billing department. I leaned closer to the monitor, the glow illuminating my face in the dark office. If the hospital bill was exactly $0, then why did Spencer and Sydney spend the last 2 months aggressively promoting a charity campaign? My mind flashed back to the videos Sydney had posted online. She would sit in her luxury SUV wearing oversized designer sunglasses, wiping away fake tears as she pleaded with her thousands of followers to help save our mother. She talked about the crushing weight of medical debt, She talked about how the insurance companies were evil and refusing to cover the anti-rejection medications. It was a perfectly crafted script designed to manipulate human empathy and generate viral sympathy. And Spencer had taken the deception even further. He had stood at the pulpit of our church, holding the microphone with a somber expression looking out over the pews. He told the congregation that he was doing everything in his power as a financial expert to negotiate with the hospital administrators, but they needed cash immediately to keep my mother on the transplant list. He preyed on the deep-rooted fears of the community. He looked those hard-working people right in the eyes and lied to their faces without blinking. I thought about the innocent people who had donated to that fraudulent campaign. Sister Adams, who lived on a fixed Social Security income, had proudly announced during Sunday service that she was giving $1,000 to help the elder's wife. Brother Thomas had organized a weekend fish fry and donated every cent of the profit to the medical fund. College students, single mothers, retired factory workers. The congregation was filled with generous, loving Black folks who believed they were wrapping their arms around a pillar of their community in her darkest hour. They had raised $250,000, $250,000 of pure tax-free charity given out of blind faith and pure love, and the medical bill was exactly zero. My hands began to shake, but not from sadness or betrayal. This was the pure adrenaline of an auditor uncovering a massive systemic fraud. My family had not just stolen my college fund years ago, they had graduated to federal crimes. They were running a charity scam masquerading as a medical crisis, and they were using my sliced open body as the emotional bait to pull the whole thing off. I pressed the print command on my keyboard. The heavy-duty laser printer in the corner of my office hummed to life, spitting out the itemized hospital invoice. I walked over and picked up the warm sheets of paper. The black ink was dark and undeniable. Patient responsibility zero. Spencer had stood in the parking lot just an hour ago, pointing his finger in my face and calling me an angry Black woman. He had warned me not to dig into the charity money. He thought his aggressive posture and his white savior complex would intimidate me into backing down. He assumed I was just a jealous sister who would cry and complain, but ultimately do absolutely nothing to stop him. He vastly underestimated the meticulous, relentless nature of a woman who spends her entire life tracing stolen assets for a living. I walked back to my desk and set the printed invoice down next to my keyboard. This document was the smoking gun, but it was only the first half of the equation. Proving that the medical bill was fake was the easy part. The real challenge, the part that would actually put federal handcuffs on his wrists, was proving where the stolen money had gone. If the $250,000 did not go to the hospital billing department, then it went somewhere else. Spencer was not the type of man to leave that kind of cash sitting idle in a GoFundMe holding account. He was a guy who bragged about venture capital and cryptocurrency portfolios. He was a guy who wore a $30,000 watch while berating his sister-in-law in a restaurant parking lot. I sat back down and cracked my neck. The dull ache in my surgical wound was still there, a constant physical reminder of their ultimate betrayal. But it fueled my hyperfocus. My father had ordered me to stay away from the church gala next week. He had threatened to cut me off and publicly shun me if I dared to ruin the illusion of his perfect, wealthy family. They wanted me to sit in silence while they accepted a Community Pillars Award for organizing a criminal enterprise. I opened a new secure tab on my browser. My access to the hospital database was just the beginning of my arsenal. As a senior financial auditor, I also had proprietary software tools to trace digital currency movements and domestic wire transfers. The charity platform they used had to disperse the collected funds to a registered bank account. All I had to do was find the routing number that received the deposit. The hunt was officially on, and I was not going to stop typing until I found every single stolen dollar. My fingers flew across the keyboard, pulling up the public charity campaign page Sydney had created. The bright, smiling photo of my mother in her hospital bed stared back at me. Beneath it was the progress bar proudly displaying the $250,000 they had successfully collected from our church family. The platform had a transparent payout history designed to assure donors that their money was being delivered to the beneficiary. I needed to see exactly where those electronic wire transfers landed. Using my corporate forensic accounting software, I ran a cross-reference on the charity platform's public ledger. It took less than 20 minutes to break through the basic privacy shields. The money had not been sent to any medical facility. It had not even been deposited into my parents' personal checking account. The platform had initiated 3 massive wire transfers over the course of the last month. All 3 transfers were routed directly to a corporate bank account located in Delaware. Delaware is notorious for acting as a domestic tax haven, a place where people can register anonymous shell companies to hide assets. To an ordinary person, a Delaware LLC is a brick wall. To a senior financial auditor who spends her days tracking health insurance fraud across state lines, it was just a minor speed bump. I logged into a specialized federal database that my department uses to verify corporate healthcare providers. I entered the routing and account numbers from the charity wire transfers. The system churned for a few seconds before spitting out the matching corporate entity. It was a limited liability company called Apex Digital Holdings. The registered agent was just a generic mail forwarding service, but I did not care about the agent. I wanted the managing member. I dug deeper, pulling the incorporation documents and the associated tax identification numbers. The screen loaded the original filing documents. There it was in plain text. The sole managing member and primary beneficiary of Apex Digital Holdings was Spencer, the fake white savior who had just stood in the parking lot and told me he had the resources to make a difference, was funneling charity money into a secret corporate shell. My jaw clenched so hard my teeth ached. I decided to tear his entire financial life apart. I ran his name and social security number through our risk assessment algorithms. Spencer loved to play the role of a highly successful venture capitalist and crypto genius. He wore tailored suits, drove a luxury SUV, and looked down his nose at my corporate job. The data told a completely different story. Spencer was not a financial genius. He was a degenerate gambler drowning in the volatile cryptocurrency market. His personal portfolio was a disaster zone of leveraged trades and risky bets that had tanked over the last year. I pulled his credit reports and banking histories. Spencer had been hit with massive margin calls from 3 different crypto exchanges. A margin call meant his account balance had fallen below the required minimum, and the brokers were demanding immediate cash deposits to cover his reckless losses. If he did not pay, they would liquidate his remaining assets and leave him completely bankrupt. He had been desperate. He was entirely broke and living on borrowed time when my mother got sick. My mother's failing kidneys were not a tragedy to Spencer. They were his ultimate bailout. I tracked the exact flow of the stolen church funds. The moment the first wire transfer of $150,000 hit his Delaware shell account, he did not pay a single medical bill. Instead, he executed an immediate electronic transfer to the crypto exchanges. He used the pension money of innocent church members to satisfy his margin calls and save his own skin from financial ruin. He used the tears of my mother and the flesh of my body to cover his terrible gambling debts. But Spencer was not just desperate, he was also incredibly greedy. The remaining $100,000 from the charity campaign sat in the Delaware account for exactly 1 week. Then he initiated another wire transfer. This time, the money did not go to a crypto exchange. I traced the routing number to a luxury marine dealership located just outside of Atlanta. I opened a new browser tab and searched the dealership's recent sales records. My stomach dropped as the images loaded. Spencer had purchased a brand new luxury speedboat, a sleek fiberglass vessel with premium leather seating and upgraded engines. He had taken the remaining charity money meant to save his mother-in-law's life and bought himself a toy. He probably planned to take his wealthy friends out on the lake this summer, drinking champagne and bragging about his successful crypto investments. I thought about the faces of the people in our congregation. The sweet elderly women who always sat in the front row and slipped hard-earned cash into the collection plate. the hard-working fathers who worked double shifts just to keep their children fed. They had dug deep into their pockets because my sister had stood before them and wept. She had painted a picture of a desperate family struggling against an unfair healthcare system. They gave their money out of pure love and unselfish devotion. Spencer took that love and used it to erase his own pathetic failures. He manipulated an entire community of generous black folks while hiding behind his tailored suits and his false superiority. The sickness of his actions made my chest tight. He was nothing but a parasite feeding off the very people he looked down upon. I leaned back and stared at the ceiling of my penthouse. My physical scar burned a constant reminder of the kidney they took from me while they stole from our community. They thought they had gotten away with the perfect crime. They thought nobody would ever ask to see the receipts because my parents were too obsessed with their prestigious image to ever question the wealthy white son-in-law. My father had ordered me to stay silent to protect the family honor. He had no idea that the honor he was protecting was just a shell company holding a stolen speedboat. My hands returned to the keyboard. I had all the proof I needed. The hospital invoice showing $0 owed, the charity platform transfer logs, the Delaware LLC incorporation papers proving Spencer's ownership, the bank records showing the margin call payments, and the marine dealership receipt. It was a perfectly documented trail of federal wire fraud and charity fraud. I gathered the printed pages and stacked them neatly on my desk. I had promised myself I would not scream or cry anymore. I was an auditor, and I was going to do what auditors do best. I was going to deliver the final absolute truth to the people who mattered most. But as I stared at the stack of printed documents on my desk, a new question gnawed at the back of my mind. How did Spencer actually get the money out of the charity platform? I knew how these large-scale church-sponsored fundraisers operated. They were heavily regulated to prevent exactly this kind of exploitation. The funds were held in a secure trust account connected to the church, and withdrawing $250,000 required strict administrative approval. Spencer could not just log in and wire the cash to his Delaware shell company on his own. He needed authorization from a verified community leader. He needed a church elder to sign off on the release forms. My fingers felt heavy as I navigated to the church's affiliated charity portal. The system was far less secure than the corporate insurance databases I audited every day. It only took me a few minutes to bypass the basic administrative firewalls and access the internal digital filing cabinet. I searched for my mother's specific medical campaign and downloaded the final disbursement authorization forms. The PDF document loaded on my screen. It detailed the 3 massive wire transfers directed to Apex Digital Holdings. I scrolled down to the bottom of the page to find the mandatory verification section. The system required a sworn statement confirming that the funds were being transferred to a legitimate medical provider or directly to the verified patient for outstanding medical debt. I stared at the digital signature on the approval line. My breath caught in my throat, and the room suddenly felt entirely devoid of oxygen. Malcolm Carter. My father's name sat there in crisp black pixels. He had electronically signed the release forms. He had authorized every single wire transfer. He had legally verified that Apex Digital Holdings was a medical entity entitled to receive the pension money of his own congregation. The gut punch was absolute. The physical pain radiating from my surgical scar was nothing compared to the crushing weight of this discovery. My father knew. He had to know. As a church elder and a supposedly astute businessman, he would never authorize a $250,000 transfer to a Delaware LLC without knowing exactly who owned it. He knew the money was not going to the hospital. He knew Spencer was drowning in crypto debt. He knew his precious son-in-law was a complete fraud. But my father signed the papers anyway. He facilitated the theft of $250,000 from the very people who trusted him to guide their spirits and protect their community. I stared at the digital footprint of my father's betrayal. I remembered all the times he had lectured me about integrity and hard work. I remembered how he had refused to help me pay for college, telling me that real success was earned, not given. Yet here he was, handing over the life savings of elderly widows to a man who had gambled it all away on digital coins. He had stolen from Sister Adams. He had stolen from Brother Thomas. He had stolen from the people who looked up to him for moral guidance. The puzzle pieces slammed together in my mind, creating a picture so grotesque it made me physically nauseous. Spencer was broke and facing complete financial ruin. If his cryptocurrency margin calls went unpaid, he would have to declare bankruptcy. His luxury SUV would be repossessed. His tailored suits and country club memberships would vanish. Sydney would be exposed as a fraud pretending to live a life of luxury while drowning in debt. The perfect marriage that my parents paraded around the church as the ultimate symbol of Black excellence would be revealed as a pathetic sham. My father could not handle that reality. He could not bear the thought of his wealthy friends and fellow church elders looking down on his golden child. He needed Spencer to remain the wealthy white savior to elevate our family status. So when my mother got sick and the community opened their hearts and wallets, my father saw the perfect bailout. He willingly handed over the congregation's money to save Spencer's fake empire. He sat back and watched me undergo agonizing surgery to remove an organ from my body so my mother could live. He let me bleed and suffer in silence so that the hospital bill would be covered completely by my insurance. And once I had taken care of the medical crisis for free, he and Spencer swooped in and stole the charity money to pay off bad investments and buy a luxury speedboat. They literally sold my kidney to fund a yacht and protect a lie. I thought about the surgical suite where they had put me under. I remembered the fear of not waking up. I remembered the weeks of not being able to walk up my own stairs without gasping in pain. I had given a piece of my body to save our family, and my father had used that sacrifice as a smokescreen to commit a federal crime. The sheer disrespect for my life and my body was staggering. They viewed me as nothing more than a spare parts facility and a convenient distraction. I stood up from my desk, my chair rolling backward and hitting the floor-to-ceiling window. The dull ache in my abdomen was completely gone now, replaced by a burning inferno of pure focused rage. My father had called me an embarrassment. He had told me I challenged the natural order of things. He had threatened to shun me if I dared to speak up at the upcoming church gala. He thought he was protecting his legacy by silencing the angry Black woman. He thought his title as a church elder made him untouchable. He thought I was just a jealous spinster who would cry in her apartment and eventually fall back into line. He was so incredibly wrong. I walked over to the stack of evidence on my desk and picked up the paper bearing his digital signature. My father did not just break my heart. He broke federal laws, wire fraud, charity fraud, tax evasion, conspiracy. He and Spencer had committed crimes that carried mandatory minimum sentences in federal prison. My mother knew about the $0 hospital bill and kept quiet so she could wear her new diamonds and play the grateful victim. Sydney knew her husband was broke and happily spent stolen church money to maintain her social media aesthetic. Spencer thought his white privilege and financial jargon made him the smartest man in the room. And my father, the great patriarch, orchestrated the entire deception to protect his fragile ego. I looked out at the Atlanta skyline. The tears were completely gone. There was no sadness left in my body. Every ounce of grief had been burned away, leaving only a sharp, glittering resolve. They wanted to hold a grand gala to celebrate their fake excellence. They wanted to stand on a stage and accept awards for their criminal enterprise. I reached for a fresh encrypted flash drive from my desk drawer. I began transferring every single document, every wire transfer log, every public record, and every digital signature onto the drive. This was no longer a family dispute. This was a meticulously documented federal case. My father had ordered me to stay away from the church gala, but I knew I had to be there. I was going to let them have their stage. I was going to let them put on their expensive suits and designer dresses. I was going to let them stand in front of the entire congregation and bask in the stolen glory. And then I was going to burn it all down. The next morning, I woke up with a singular focus. I did not call my mother. I did not text my sister. I completely ignored the barrage of passive-aggressive messages from Spencer that had piled up on my phone overnight. Confronting them now would only give them time to hide the money or destroy the paper trail. Instead, I treated this like the most important audit of my entire career. I fired up my secure home office printer and watched as page after page of undeniable proof slid into the output tray. The $0 hospital bill, the Delaware Shell Company registration, the bank routing numbers showing the stolen charity funds paying off crypto margin calls, and the final piece of the puzzle, my father's digital signature authorizing the entire fraudulent scheme. I carefully placed every single document into a thick red binder. It was a neat, irrefutable package of federal crimes. In my line of work, tracking health insurance fraud, you make a lot of powerful connections. You do not rise to the level of senior audit director without knowing exactly who to call when millions of dollars go missing. I picked up my phone and dialed a direct line I had memorized years ago. It belonged to a senior investigator in the FBI Financial Crimes Division right here in Atlanta. We had worked together on a massive corporate embezzlement case 2 years prior, and he knew that when I called with a tip, it was always an open and shut case. He answered on the second ring. I skipped the small talk and told him I had a complete, meticulously documented file on a $250,000 wire fraud and charity fraud operation. I explained that the perpetrators had set up a fake medical GoFundMe and systematically drained the life savings of an elderly minority church congregation to pay off personal gambling debts. The moment I mentioned that a church elder was actively facilitating the theft of pension money from his own Black community, the tone of his voice changed completely. The feds do not take kindly to predators who exploit vulnerable congregations under the guise of religious salvation and medical emergencies. I also made sure to mention the tax evasion aspect, knowing the IRS would be equally thrilled to tear into Spencer's finances. We agreed to meet at a secure coffee shop a few blocks from the federal building. I handed the agent the thick red binder and the encrypted flash drive. He sat there in his sharp gray suit, flipping through the pages. I watched his eyes scan the routing numbers, the fake Delaware LLC, and the $0 hospital invoice. He shook his head in disgust. He told me this was one of the most thoroughly documented fraud packages he had ever been handed. There was no need for a lengthy preliminary investigation because I had already done all the heavy lifting. I had handed the FBI and the IRS a golden ticket to federal convictions. All they needed to do was execute the arrests and seize the assets. 3 days later, a thick cream-colored envelope arrived in my mailbox. It was a formal invitation to the annual church gala. The event was being held at a lavish banquet hall downtown, designed to celebrate the pillars of our community. My stomach turned as I read the gold-embossed letters. They were really going through with it. They were going to stand in front of the very people they had robbed and accept an award for their fake heroism. My phone buzzed on the counter. It was a text message from my father. It read, "I see the church sent you an invitation despite my warnings. If you insist on coming to save face, sit in the back and keep your mouth shut. Do not ruin your sister's special night." He was still trying to intimidate me. He still believed he held all the power because he was the patriarch, and I was just the bitter, unloved daughter. He thought his harsh words would make me shrink into the shadows and watch his golden child receive the glory she never earned. He wanted me to be the quiet scapegoat sitting in the back row while they flaunted the money they had stolen in the name of my missing kidney. I typed my response carefully, making sure my hands were completely steady. I replied, I would not miss it for the world. I immediately called my contact at the FBI. I told him exactly where Spencer, Sidney, and my father would be on Saturday night. I told him they would be standing on a stage in a rented banquet hall, surrounded by the exact people they had defrauded. I gave him the schedule of events, the layout of the venue, and the exact time they were set to receive their fake Community Pillars Award. The agent agreed that there was no better time or place to execute the federal arrest warrants. Not only would it prevent them from fleeing or transferring the remaining stolen funds to offshore accounts, but it would also serve as a very public statement to the community. The feds wanted to make an example out of Spencer and my father, and I was more than happy to facilitate the spectacle. We spent the next 2 days coordinating the logistics of the live takedown. I provided the FBI with the guest list to ensure no innocent church members would be caught in the crossfire. I arranged for plainclothes agents to be stationed near the exits and the stage well before the award ceremony began. I even paid the audiovisual team at the venue a very generous tip under the table to ensure I would have unrestricted access to the main projector and the sound system when the time was right. My family had spent my entire life trying to silence me. They had literally taken a piece of my body and then told me to sit in the back of the room and keep my mouth shut while they stole from our people. They had built a fragile glass house on a foundation of lies, greed, and white savior complexes. I hung up the phone with the FBI and looked at my tailored crimson suit hanging on the closet door. It was the outfit I had chosen for the gala, a power color that demanded attention, a color that perfectly matched the fresh scar they left on my body. Saturday night was rapidly approaching, and the federal trap was perfectly set. My father wanted a show of black excellence and prestige. He was about to get a front-row seat to the most unforgettable performance of his entire life. The night of the gala arrived with a suffocating humidity that clung to the Atlanta streets. But inside the grand ballroom of the downtown banquet hall, the air was crisp and thick with expensive cologne and designer perfumes. I handed my keys to the valet and took a slow, deliberate breath before stepping onto the plush carpet of the foyer. The pain in my side was a sharp, burning reminder of the kidney I no longer had, but I forced my spine straight. I smoothed the lapels of my tailored crimson suit, making sure the heavy surgical dressing was completely concealed beneath the structured fabric. The bold red color was a stark contrast to the sea of conservative black and gold gowns filling the room. It was a statement, a warning they were too blind to see. I walked through the double doors and was immediately hit by the sheer scale of the hypocrisy on display. Huge velvet banners hung from the vaulted ceilings, proudly displaying the theme of the evening in glittering cursive letters, reading generational wealth and excellence. The irony was so thick it was almost suffocating. Hundreds of prominent community members filled the room. There were local politicians shaking hands with megachurch pastors, business owners networking over crystal flutes of champagne, and the very elite of our community completely unaware that they were financing a criminal enterprise. I stood near the back of the room, exactly where my father had ordered me to stay, keeping to the shadows as I surveyed the glittering fake empire he had built. It did not take long to spot them. Sydney and Spencer were holding court near the center ice sculpture, basking in the adoration of the crowd. Spencer wore a bespoke tuxedo that hugged his shoulders, perfectly purchased, no doubt, with the money he had skimmed from the charity fund. Sydney clung to his arm, wearing a silk gown and a smile so practiced it looked painful. I watched as a steady stream of elderly churchgoers approached them. These were the people who had emptied their modest savings accounts, who had given up their grocery money and medication funds to save my mother's life. I saw Sister Adams, a retired schoolteacher who lived on a fixed income, reach out with trembling hands to grasp Spencer's arm. She looked up at him with tears in her eyes, thanking him for being such a blessing to our community. Spencer placed his other hand over hers, bowing his head in a display of fake humility that made my stomach churn. He smiled and accepted her praise, absorbing the worship of a woman whose pension he had stolen to pay off his failed cryptocurrency bets. Sydney played her part flawlessly, dabbing at her dry eyes and hugging the church members, telling them how hard the journey had been and how blessed they were to have such a generous congregation. They paraded around the ballroom, soaking up the handshakes and the blessings, feeding off the admiration like absolute parasites. They were acting as if they were royalty, descending from their high castle to accept the tribute of the loyal peasants below them. My eyes drifted away from the golden couple and found the guest of honor. My mother Brenda sat in a highly stylized wheelchair near the head table, positioned perfectly so everyone could pay their respects to the brave survivor. She was playing the role of the fragile, recovering matriarch to perfection. But the illusion broke the moment I looked at her neck and wrists. Draped across her collarbone was a thick, stunning diamond tennis necklace that caught the light from the chandeliers. Matching diamond drop earrings swung from her ears and a heavy tennis bracelet circled her wrist. I knew my parents' financial situation perfectly well. I knew my father had leveraged everything to maintain his status, and I knew my mother did not own that jewelry a month ago. The realization hit me like a physical blow to the chest. They had not just bought a luxury speedboat with the stolen church funds. They had taken the money meant to save her life and bought her a suite of diamonds so she could look wealthy at the very gala where they were accepting charity. She was literally wearing the stolen retirement funds of the elderly women who were currently weeping over her miraculous recovery. She sat there sparkling in the stolen wealth, smiling graciously as people dropped envelopes of additional cash donations into a decorative box on her table. My father stood right beside her, his chest puffed out playing the role of the devoted husband and the prestigious church elder. He shook hands with local politicians, boasting about his brilliant son-in-law and the unbreakable strength of our black family. He was selling them a masterclass in deception, and they were buying every single word of it. The rage I felt was no longer hot and erratic. It was a freezing, absolute zero. I watched my family laugh and drink and revel in their untouchable status. They had convinced themselves that they were untouchable because of the walls of the church and the color of their skin and the illusion of their wealth. They believed that nobody would ever look past the designer clothes and the religious rhetoric to see the rot festering underneath. I took a sip of my sparkling water, feeling the cool liquid coat my dry throat. The plainclothes FBI agents were already in the room, seamlessly blending in with the catering staff and the security personnel near the exits. I had caught the briefest nod from the lead agent who was standing by the service doors, pretending to review a catering manifest. The trap was set, and the jaws were just minutes away from snapping shut. I watched my sister laugh at a joke a city councilman made, throwing her head back and flashing her perfectly white teeth. She was so incredibly arrogant, so blind to the reality of what was about to happen. I stood there in my crimson suit, bearing the physical scars of their survival, waiting for the music to stop. They wanted to be the center of attention, and they were about to get exactly what they asked for. I watched the crowd shift and part as the catering staff brought out silver trays of appetizers. Through the moving bodies, my eyes locked with my mother. She was still sitting at the head table, the heavy diamonds glittering on her chest. Her smile dropped the absolute instant she saw my crimson suit. The color drained from her face, leaving her looking gray and suddenly very old under the bright chandelier lights. She leaned over and whispered frantically to the private nurse she had hired to push her wheelchair around the event. The nurse nodded and began navigating the chair through the crowded ballroom, heading away from the main floor and toward the private VIP suites lining the back hallway. My mother gave me a sharp, desperate look, a silent command to follow her. I took a slow breath and walked past the giant ice sculpture and the oblivious donors, following the trail of her wheelchair. The nurse pushed her into a small, elegant room reserved for the guest speakers and high-profile politicians. My mother dismissed the nurse with a wave of her diamond-covered wrist, ordering her to stand guard outside the door and not let anyone inside. The heavy oak door clicked shut, leaving just the two of us in the quiet room. The muffled sounds of the gala outside felt like they were miles away. My mother did not waste any time pretending to care about my health or my recovery. She gripped the leather armrests of her wheelchair, her knuckles turning stark white against her dark skin. "Morgan, you need to leave right now," she hissed, her voice trembling with a toxic mixture of panic and rage. "Your father told you to stay home. Why are you doing this to us? Why are you trying to destroy this family tonight of all nights?" I stood near the center of the room, looking down at the woman I had literally given a piece of my body to save. "I am not destroying anything," I said, my voice perfectly calm and devoid of the fear she expected. "I am just watching a performance. I paid a very high price for my ticket, so I think I deserve to see the ending." My mother let out a frustrated breath, shaking her head as if I was a stubborn toddler. You do not understand what is at stake tonight, Morgan. Spencer is closing a massive real estate deal with the mayor and the city council. This award ceremony is the final piece he needs to secure their trust and lock in the investors. If you go out there and cause a scene, you will ruin your sister's life. You will humiliate your father in front of his entire congregation, and you will destroy everything we have built. I looked at her stolen diamonds glittering under the recessed lighting of the VIP room. And what about my life? I asked, stepping closer to her wheelchair. What about the fact that Spencer and Sydney stole $250,000 from the church? What about the fact that you let them take the credit for the kidney I gave you? You watched me suffer alone in my apartment, bleeding and unable to walk, while you paraded them around as your saviors. My mother reached out and grabbed my hand. Her fingers were cold and desperate. Morgan, please, she pleaded, fake tears pooling in her eyes. You are a strong, independent woman. You have your career and your money. You do not need the validation. Sydney needs this. She needs to feel important, and Spencer needs this deal to provide for her. Be a good daughter and carry this cross for us. God will reward your silent sacrifice. We are Black people in a world that wants to see us fail. We have to protect our image at all costs. Do not let them see us fall apart. Carry this cross for us. The words hung in the sterile air of the VIP suite. She was using our race, our faith, and my independence as weapons to force me into submission. She wanted me to be the strong Black woman who absorbs all the pain, all the theft, and all the disrespect, just so her golden child could play house with a white fraud. She was asking me to swallow federal crimes and a stolen pension fund to protect a fake legacy. She was weaponizing my resilience to protect her favorite child. I looked down at her hands gripping mine. I did not feel any anger anymore. The burning rage that had propelled me through the hospital databases and the FBI meetings was completely gone. All that was left was a profound, hollow pity. I looked deep into my mother's eyes, searching for even a sliver of maternal love, of genuine gratitude for the life I had handed back to her. There was nothing there. The well was completely dry. She was just a desperate socialite terrified of losing her country club status and her stolen jewelry. I gently but firmly pulled my hand out of her grasp. I stepped back, putting an emotional and physical distance between us that would last for the rest of my life. You traded my flesh and blood for a fake Rolex and a white savior complex. I said, the words falling from my lips like heavy stones. You sold out the very people who prayed for your healing just so you could wear stolen diamonds to a church party. My mother gasped, her hand flying to her throat as if I had physically struck her. Morgan, how can you speak to your mother like that? You are not my mother anymore, I replied, my voice dropping to a dead whisper. A mother protects her children. A mother does not slice one open to feed the other. You made your choice when you signed off on those wire transfers with Dad. You chose the illusion, so you can sit here and watch it shatter. I turned around and walked toward the heavy wooden door. She called my name, sobbing, telling me that I was a bitter, jealous child who would die alone. Her words bounced off me without leaving a single mark. She had no power over me anymore. The emotional chains that had bound me to this family for 33 years dissolved into dust. I opened the door and stepped back out into the bright, noisy hallway, leaving her weeping in her wheelchair, surrounded by the hollow victory of her stolen wealth. The gala was waiting, and the music was about to stop. As the heavy wooden door clicked shut behind me, blocking out the sound of my mother's pathetic sobbing, I took a moment to adjust my tailored crimson blazer. The hallway leading back to the main ballroom was lined with expensive floral arrangements and gold-framed mirrors reflecting the artificial grandeur of the evening. I took exactly 3 steps down the carpeted corridor before a large hand suddenly slammed against the wall right in front of me, cutting off my path. The smell of expensive and overly strong cologne hit my nose before I even turned my head. It was Spencer. He had obviously been tracking my movements from the main floor and followed my mother and me into the secluded hallway. His face was flushed a patchy pink color that clashed violently with his stark white collar and bespoke tuxedo. The smug, charming mask he had been wearing out there for the elderly church members was completely gone. In its place was the raw, aggressive arrogance of a man who firmly believed his skin color and his fake bank account made him a literal god among peasants. "What is your endgame here, Morgan?" he sneered, looking down at me with absolute contempt. "You just could not stay in your lane, could you? Your father warned you to stay away, but you had to show up in that ridiculous red suit begging for attention." He did not even wait for me to answer. He reached into the inner pocket of his tailored jacket and pulled out a leather-bound checkbook. He clicked a gold pen and leaned against the wall, treating the floral stand like a desk. I watched his hand move furiously across the paper, writing out a number. He ripped the check from the binding and shoved it directly into my chest, forcing me to catch it before it fell to the floor. I looked down at the piece of paper. $5,000. It was written out from a joint account he shared with Sydney. "Take this for your medical leave and get lost." Spencer spat, his voice low and dripping with malice. "Consider it a generous tip for your services. Buy yourself something nice, maybe a vacation so you can stop obsessing over your sister. You will never be in our tax bracket, Morgan. You do not have the vision, and you certainly do not have the pedigree. We are building an empire here tonight, and you are just a minor inconvenience. So take the charity and stop trying to drag us down to your miserable level." I stood there holding the check. $5,000. He was offering me a $5,000 bribe drawn from an account that was likely funded by the very church members sitting in the next room. He honestly believed he could buy my silence with the scraps of his stolen wealth. He thought this piece of paper was enough to erase the trauma of my surgery, the theft of $250,000, and the manipulation of an entire community. I looked at the smug, arrogant smirk plastered across his face. He was so incredibly clueless, so utterly convinced of his own invincibility. He looked at me and saw a desperate black woman he could simply buy off and swat away. He did not see the senior audit director who had just handed his entire financial history over to the federal government. He did not see the architect of his impending doom. I did not scream. I did not raise my voice. I simply gripped the edges of the check and ripped it cleanly down the middle. The sharp tearing sound echoed perfectly in the quiet hallway. I put the two halves together and ripped them again, letting the small pieces flutter out of my hands and drift down like snow, landing directly on the tips of his highly polished, expensive leather shoes. "Keep it, Spencer," I said, my voice dropping to a smooth, chilling whisper. "You are going to need commissary money where you are going." Spencer looked down at the torn pieces of paper on his shoes, and then back up at me. His thick blonde eyebrows pulled together in a knot of genuine confusion. The confident smirk faltered, replaced by a flicker of absolute bewilderment. He opened his mouth to speak, to hurl another insult, or perhaps demand an explanation, but his brain could not process the threat. The concept of a black woman telling him he was heading to prison simply did not compute in his arrogant mind. He thought he was untouchable, protected by his marriage to the pastor's favored family and his own perceived superiority. I did not give him the chance to figure it out. I stepped around his frozen figure, my heels clicking rhythmically against the floor. The dull ache in my side was completely forgotten, replaced by the cold, steady rush of adrenaline. I walked straight toward the glowing double doors of the grand ballroom, leaving the fake white savior standing in the hallway, staring at the shredded remnants of his pathetic bribe. The award ceremony was about to begin, and I had a front row seat waiting for me. I pushed the doors open and let the noise of the gala wash over me, ready to watch the illusion shatter. I found my assigned seat near the back of the grand ballroom, just as the overhead chandeliers dimmed, leaving only a warm golden glow over the tables. A single bright spotlight illuminated the main stage, where our church pastor stood behind a clear acrylic podium. The room settled into a reverent hush. The clinking of silverware stopped, and everyone turned their attention to the front, completely captivated by the emotional atmosphere the event planners had so carefully constructed. The pastor adjusted his microphone and looked out over the crowd of hundreds of wealthy donors, local politicians, and faithful church members. He spoke with that practiced, rhythmic cadence designed to pull tears from the audience. He talked about the trials and tribulations of life, about how our faith is continually tested through sickness and profound adversity. He spoke about my mother Brenda and her miraculous recovery from total kidney failure, calling it a shining testament to the power of community prayer and unyielding love. But then the pastor pivoted from spiritual healing to family devotion. He wiped a single tear from his own eye and told the crowd that miracles do not just fall from the sky, they are built by the hands of willing servants. He pointed directly at my father Malcolm, who was sitting at the head table puffing out his chest with unearned pride. And then the pastor called my sister Sydney and her husband Spencer to the stage to receive the highest honor of the night, the Community Pillars Award. The entire ballroom erupted into a deafening standing ovation. Elderly women in the front rows were weeping openly, dabbing their eyes with tissues as they watched the golden couple walk up the carpeted steps. Sydney held on to Spencer's arm, looking like a fragile, perfect angel in her flowing silk gown. Spencer led her to the podium, waving to the crowd with that same arrogant smirk he had just used to offer me a $5,000 bribe in the hallway. He looked like a man who believed he had just successfully conquered the world and everyone in it. The pastor handed them a heavy glass trophy engraved with their names. He hugged Spencer tightly, whispering something in his ear that made the fake white savior nod with absolute manufactured humility. The applause lasted for nearly 2 full minutes. It was a sickening display of mass manipulation. I sat in the shadows and watched these hard-working people cheer for the very thieves who had systematically drained their retirement accounts to buy a luxury speedboat and pay off cryptocurrency debts. Spencer adjusted the microphone and leaned in, bringing his lips close to the metal grate. The room went completely silent, hanging on his every word. He started speaking in a soft, trembling voice that he must have practiced in the mirror for hours before arriving tonight. He talked about how scared they were when Brenda got sick. He talked about the sleepless nights, the desperate prayers, and the crushing weight of the medical system. And then he delivered the ultimate lie. He looked out at the congregation and placed his hand over his heart. He said that he did not raise the money himself, but that God had simply guided his hands to collect the blessings of the community. He thanked the church for their $250,000 sacrifice, claiming that every single penny had gone directly to the hospital to save his mother-in-law's life. He told them that their generosity had prevented our family from losing everything, and that he would spend the rest of his life paying forward their kindness. Sydney leaned into the microphone to add her own performance. She let a few tears slip down her perfectly contoured cheeks, sobbing gently as she thanked her husband for being the rock of their family. She called him a true blessing to the Black community, a man who saw no color when it came to love and sacrifice and standing up for what was right. My father stood up from his table and applauded them again, his face glowing with the fake prestige he had bought with my stolen kidney. As the second round of applause finally began to die down, as Spencer raised the glass trophy one last time to the cheering crowd, I made my move. I stepped out from the shadows of the back row. The heavy oak doors were closed behind me, trapping everyone inside the illusion. I stepped onto the main aisle of the ballroom, leaving the darkness behind. The room was so quiet now that the only sound was the sharp rhythmic clicking of my heels against the exposed hardwood running alongside the carpeted aisle. Click, click, click. The sound cut through the lingering echoes of applause like a metronome counting down to their absolute destruction. I kept my posture perfectly straight, my tailored crimson suit burning like a beacon of reality in the dimly lit room. The pain in my side flared up with every step, but I used it as fuel, pushing myself forward. 2 ushers stepped forward to intercept me, holding up their hands to guide me back to my seat. They thought I was just an emotional family member disrupting the schedule, but I did not even break my stride. I looked right through them with a gaze so cold and focused, they instinctively dropped their hands and stepped aside. The murmurs started rippling through the crowd as people turned in their chairs and recognized me. They recognized the older sister, the unmarried auditor, who had supposedly done nothing to help her dying mother, while the white son-in-law saved the day. I reached the front of the room and did not stop. I walked right up the carpeted stairs and stepped onto the main stage. Spencer's fake smile froze instantly on his face. The heavy glass trophy in his hand suddenly looked like it weighed 100 pounds. Sydney's eyes widened in sheer terror as she realized I had not stayed in the back, and I was definitely not going to keep my mouth shut. My father half stood from his chair at the head table, his face contorting with absolute panic as he realized his warnings had failed. I walked directly up to the clear acrylic podium, standing right next to the golden couple. I did not look at my father, and I did not look at my mother sitting in her wheelchair, wearing her stolen diamonds. I looked directly at the pastor who was staring at me in complete and utter confusion. I reached out and firmly wrapped my fingers around the microphone, pulling it away from Spencer. I pulled the heavy microphone from its stand, and the screech of audio feedback pierced the air, making several people in the front rows cover their ears. Spencer tried to reach for my arm, but I shot him a look so lethal he froze completely in place. Sydney was shaking next to him, clutching the glass trophy like a shield. Down at the head table, my father Malcolm violently shoved his chair back. It tipped over and crashed onto the floor. He pointed a shaking finger at me and screamed at the top of his lungs, telling the ushers to remove me from the stage. When that did not work, he turned his furious gaze to the back of the room, yelling frantically at the audiovisual team to cut my microphone. He ordered them to kill the power to the stage, to play music, to do absolutely anything to drown me out. But nothing happened. The microphone in my hand remained perfectly live. My voice echoed through the massive speakers with crystal clear precision. My father did not know that I had visited the sound booth an hour before the gala began. I had handed the lead technician a very thick envelope of cash and instructed him to lock the booth doors from the inside and ignore any commands from the church elders until I was finished speaking. I watched from the stage as my father actually ran up the side aisle and began pounding his fists against the locked door of the sound booth, his face purple with rage. The power was entirely mine now. I looked out at the sea of hundreds of faces staring up at me. Elderly women who had emptied their purses for my family. Working men who had given their weekend pay. They were all watching me with wide, confused eyes, waiting to see why the angry older sister was ruining this beautiful moment of Christian charity. My mother, Brenda, was shrinking down in her stylized wheelchair, trying to hide her face while the stolen diamonds hung heavy around her neck. I held the microphone close to my mouth and took a slow breath. The pain in my side was screaming, but it only made my voice steadier. Spencer did not find a miracle anonymous donor. I said, my words ringing out through the silent ballroom. There was no mysterious stranger who descended from heaven to save my mother's life. I looked directly at Sister Adams, who was sitting in the front row, still clutching a tissue. I am the donor, I told them. I gave my mother my left kidney. A heavy, confused silence blanketed the room. People were glancing at each other, trying to process the magnitude of what I had just said. My father was shouting from the back of the room that I was a liar, that I was mentally unstable and having a breakdown. He was screaming desperately to maintain the illusion of his perfect family. I did not argue with him. I simply reached into my pocket and pulled out a small remote control. I clicked the main button. The massive projector screen suspended directly behind the podium flickered to life. The bright white light illuminated the entire stage, casting Spencer and Sydney in a harsh, unforgiving glare. The screen displayed a high-resolution scan of my official organ donor registry match forms. Next to it was the surgical intake document from the hospital. My name, Morgan Carter, was printed in bold black letters right next to my mother, Brenda Carter's name. The medical files detailed the exact date and time of the organ extraction and the subsequent transplant. It was undeniable clinical proof stamped with the official seal of the transplant board. Murmurs started rippling through the crowd as people squinted to read the massive documents displayed behind me. But medical records can be forged in the minds of desperate people who want to believe their church leaders are honest. I needed to give them something they could not possibly deny. Something visceral and real. I set the microphone back onto the podium stand so my hands were free. I turned slightly to the side, ensuring the stage lights caught my every movement. With slow, deliberate precision, I reached for the buttons of my tailored crimson blazer. I undid the first button, then the second. Spencer took a large step back, his face draining of all color as he realized what I was about to do. Sydney covered her mouth with her trembling hands, letting out a quiet whimper. I pulled the left side of my blazer open and lifted the hem of my crisp white silk blouse. The bright stage lights hit my exposed torso. There, running along my side and abdomen, was a thick, heavy surgical dressing. The medical tape was stark white against my dark skin. Right in the center of the fresh bandages, a small circle of dark red blood was actively seeping through the gauze. It was a raw, brutal testament to the flesh and organ that had been carved out of my body just weeks ago. My breathing was shallow, allowing everyone in the room to see the physical trauma I had endured to save the woman sitting at the head table. The entire ballroom erupted. It was not just gasps. It was a collective, horrifying shock that tore through the hundreds of people in attendance. Elderly women cried out in disbelief, pressing their hands over their hearts and staring at my bleeding side. Men stood up from their tables, pointing at the enormous medical records on the screen, and then at my exposed surgical wound. The illusion was completely shattered. The pristine image of the golden couple and the wealthy white savior disintegrated right in front of their eyes into a million unfixable pieces. The sound of hundreds of outraged and devastated voices filled the grand hall, drowning out my father's pathetic attempts to yell over the crowd. I let them look for a long, agonizing moment, letting the absolute reality of my sacrifice burn into their minds. I stood there bearing my pain, proudly letting the congregation see exactly who had paid the price for my mother's survival. Then I slowly lowered my silk blouse and buttoned my crimson blazer back up, restoring my flawless corporate armor. I picked up the microphone again, the cold metal grounding me as the chaos swelled around the room, waiting to drop the next piece of the truth. The heavy silence in the room was suddenly broken by a high-pitched scream. It was Sydney. She had dropped the heavy glass award onto the stage, where it shattered into thick, sharp pieces around her designer heels. She lunged toward me, her face twisted in panic and rage, trying to grab the microphone from my hand. "She is insane!" Sydney shrieked, her voice cracking, without the amplification of the speakers. "Do not listen to her. She is having a mental breakdown. She forged those documents because she is jealous of my marriage. She is a sick, bitter woman." I did not even flinch. I simply stepped to the side, letting her stumble past me in her heavy silk gown. Spencer grabbed her arm, pulling her back before she could fall off the edge of the stage. His face was slick with cold sweat. He was looking out at the crowd, realizing that his white savior complex could not protect him from the undeniable visual proof of my bleeding scar and the official medical registry. The congregation was not looking at Sydney with pity anymore. They were looking at her with growing suspicion. I raised the microphone back to my lips, keeping my voice smooth and deadpan. "I am not having a breakdown, Sydney," I said, watching her shrink against her husband's chest. "I am just giving an audit presentation. And every good auditor knows that the physical evidence is only half the story. You have to follow the money." I lifted my small remote and clicked the button a second time. The massive projector screen behind us blinked and a new document appeared, stretching 20 feet across the back wall of the stage. It was the official final invoice from the hospital billing department. I had highlighted the most important sections in bright yellow, so that even the people sitting in the very back row could read the numbers clearly. The gross charges for the kidney transplant, the surgical team, the intensive care room, and the anti-rejection drugs were all listed line by itemized line. The total was over $600,000. I pointed up at the screen. As you can see, the medical expenses for my mother's surgery were indeed massive. I told the crowd, my voice ringing through the grand ballroom. But what Spencer and Sydney conveniently forgot to mention during their tearful GoFundMe campaign is that they never received a bill for a single cent of it. I clicked the remote one more time, zooming in on the bottom right corner of the hospital invoice. The bright yellow highlight illuminated the final calculation: total patient responsibility, $0.00. I watched the faces in the congregation as they read those words. Elderly women who had donated their Social Security checks adjusted their reading glasses, staring at the giant zero on the screen. Men who had worked overtime to contribute to the medical fund stopped murmuring and stood completely still, because I was the living donor and the primary guarantor. I explained, speaking slowly so every single syllable landed with maximum impact. My executive platinum corporate health insurance policy kicked in at 100%. There were no deductibles. There were no copays. The hospital directly billed my corporate network, and my employer paid the entire $600,000 balance without question. My mother walked out of that hospital fully healed and entirely debt-free. The air in the room grew incredibly dense, the kind of heavy, oppressive atmosphere that precedes a violent thunderstorm. The realization was washing over the hundreds of prominent community members, church leaders, and local politicians. They were looking at the giant zero on the screen and then looking down at their own empty pockets. I turned my body slowly away from the screen and faced the golden couple standing a few feet away from me. Spencer looked like he was going to vomit. His hands were shaking so badly, he had to shove them into the pockets of his expensive tuxedo. Sydney was shaking her head back and forth, whispering no over and over again, as if she could magically erase the 20-foot document glowing behind her. I looked out at the sea of betrayed faces in the pews. I looked at Sister Adams, who was now clutching her chest. I looked at the church ushers who had emptied their savings. And then I raised the microphone and asked the $250,000 question. So my question to Sydney and Spencer is very simple, I said, my voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. If the hospital bill was exactly $0, where is the $250,000 that this congregation sacrificed their life savings to give you? Absolute chaos broke out in the pews. It was not just murmurs anymore. It was an eruption of pure visceral outrage. Dozens of people started shouting at the stage, demanding answers. Chairs were pushed back and scraped loudly against the floor as men and women began storming the aisles, marching directly toward the front of the room. A wave of betrayed, furious voices crashed against the stage. People were shouting that they wanted their money back. A man in the third row yelled that he had taken out a second loan to help the elder's family and demanded to know where his funds went. The noise was deafening. The pastor who had just handed them the Community Pillars Award was standing off to the side, gripping his Bible, his mouth hanging open in complete shock. He looked from the giant zero on the screen to Spencer, and then to my father, realizing his church had been used as a giant ATM for a white fraudster. Down at the head table, my mother Brenda was shrinking into her wheelchair, trying to cover the thick diamond tennis necklace that rested on her collarbone. The very diamonds she had bought with the stolen pension money of the people currently swarming the stage. Women from her own sorority were pointing down at her jewelry, their faces twisted in absolute disgust as they realized what she had done. My father Malcolm was trapped against the sidewall, still pounding on the locked sound booth door, looking like a cornered animal as his pristine reputation disintegrated into dust. Sydney burst into hysterical tears, clinging to Spencer's tuxedo jacket and burying her face in his chest. Spencer was looking around wildly for an exit, his eyes darting toward the service doors at the back of the stage. He was a coward, stripped of his fake prestige, standing naked in front of the community he had exploited. He thought he could just slip away into the service corridors and disappear into the night before the angry crowd reached the stairs. He thought his tailored suit and his arrogant swagger could somehow shield him from the consequences of robbing a black church blind. I stood perfectly still behind the acrylic podium, watching the fake empire burn to the ground. I did not try to stop Spencer as he took a step backward. I just watched him retreat because I knew exactly what was waiting for him on the other side of those doors. Spencer grabbed the fabric of Sydney's dress and practically dragged her toward the heavy oak service doors at the right side of the stage. He was no longer the confident venture capitalist or the proud community pillar. He was just a desperate cornered thief trying to slip out the back exit while the people he robbed were screaming in the aisles. His expensive leather shoes crunched over the shattered remains of the glass award he had just been holding. Sydney was sobbing uncontrollably, stumbling behind him and begging him to fix it. She honestly believed her white husband could just talk his way out of a room full of angry, betrayed churchgoers. I did not move a single muscle. I just stood behind the podium and watched the pathetic display of cowardice unfold. Before Spencer's sweating hand could even reach the brass handle of the service door, the heavy wood violently swung inward. The force of the impact made Spencer jump back, stumbling over his own feet. It was not the catering staff bringing out the next course. It was not the venue security coming to break up the angry crowd. A flood of tactical, dark blue windbreakers poured into the grand ballroom. The bright yellow letters printed across their backs and chests were unmistakable. FBI and IRS. Federal agents moved into the room with absolute military precision, pouring through the side doors, the main entrances, and the backstage corridors all at once. The sheer, overwhelming presence of federal law enforcement hit the ballroom like a shockwave. The angry shouts of the congregation instantly died down. The church elders who had been marching toward the stage froze in their tracks. Men and women stepped back, creating a wide, clear path as badges were flashed under the glowing crystal chandeliers. The tactical boots of the agents thudded heavily against the hardwood floor, cutting through the stunned silence of the room. The lead agent walked straight up the center stairs of the stage. It was the same broad-shouldered investigator I had met at the coffee shop 3 days ago. He did not look at the pastor. He did not look at my father, who was now trembling violently near the back wall. He walked directly toward Spencer. Spencer threw his hands up in the air, palms facing out in a pathetic display of surrender. His chest was heaving, his breathing shallow and erratic. "Wait, there is a misunderstanding," he stammered, his voice cracking into a high-pitched whine. "You do not understand who I am. I have lawyers. I can clear this up right now." The lead agent did not even slow down. He reached. Spencer grabbed him by the shoulder of his bespoke tuxedo and spun him around so forcefully that Spencer slammed chest first into the stage wall. The heavy metallic click of handcuffs ratcheting shut echoed sharply across the dead silent ballroom. "Spencer Thomas, you are under federal arrest." The agent's voice boomed across the unamplified room, carrying absolute unwavering authority. Sydney screamed a raw, piercing sound of pure terror. She tried to lunge toward her husband, but 2 female agents immediately stepped forward and grabbed her arms. They twisted her around, pushing her down, forcing her to her knees right there on the stage. Sydney sobbed hysterically, kicking her legs and begging her mother to do something. Her perfect silk gown bunched up around her waist, her designer heels scraping uselessly against the floor as the cold steel cuffs locked around her wrists. The lead agent turned to face the hundreds of prominent community members, watching in absolute horror. He read the charges loud and clear so that every single person who had donated their hard-earned pension money would know exactly what was happening. "We are executing arrest warrants for wire fraud, charity fraud, and federal tax evasion," the agent announced. The words hung in the humid air of the ballroom. Wire fraud, charity fraud, tax evasion, the holy trinity of financial crimes. The golden couple was officially being indicted for stealing $250,000 from a minority church community and funneling it into a Delaware shell company to pay off crypto debts and buy luxury boats. My mother Brenda sat frozen in her wheelchair at the head table. Her hands were clasped over her mouth, her eyes wide with unblinking shock. The heavy stolen diamonds around her neck suddenly looked like heavy iron chains. She watched as her precious golden child, the daughter she had always favored and protected, was dragged to her feet by federal agents, her makeup running down her face in dark, ugly streaks. "You have the right to remain silent." The agent began reading them. "They're Miranda rights," his voice steady and relentless. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. Spencer was weeping now, actual tears streaming down his flushed face as he begged the agents to let him call his broker. He was pleading for a chance to wire the funds back, promising he could make the congregation whole if they just gave him one more day. It was the ultimate admission of guilt, broadcast live to the very people he had deemed beneath his tax bracket. I stood perfectly still behind the clear acrylic podium, watching the flawless execution of the trap I had set. They had told me to sit in the back and keep my mouth shut so they could accept their Community Pillars Award. Now they were standing in front of that same community in federal handcuffs, having their rights read to them, while their fake empire burned entirely to the ground. The illusion was completely dead, replaced by the harsh, unforgiving reality of the justice system. The crowd watched in stunned silence as the perfect couple was paraded across the stage, their heads bowed in ultimate humiliation. The prestige they had craved, the image my parents had sacrificed my body to maintain it, was all gone in the span of 5 breathtaking minutes. And I was not done yet. There was still one final piece of the puzzle left to destroy, and it belonged to the man who had authorized the entire scam. My father, Malcolm, broke through the paralysis that had kept him pinned against the back wall. He scrambled forward, pushing past the stunned church elders and stumbling over the discarded chairs. His face was a mask of sheer desperation. He reached the edge of the stage, his hands shaking as he grabbed the arm of the lead federal agent. "This is a mistake," my father screamed, his voice cracking under the weight of his collapsing reality. "You have the wrong people. My son-in-law is a legitimate businessman. My daughter is innocent. Let them go right now. I will post their bail. I will put up my $800,000 house as collateral right this second. Just take these handcuffs off my family." The federal agent did not even blink. He simply brushed my father's hand off his tactical jacket with a look of absolute disgust. "Bail is not determined here, sir," the agent said flatly. "They are going to federal holding. You can discuss your property with the judge on Monday morning." I watched my father beg. The proud patriarch of our family, the man who had demanded I sit in the back and keep my mouth shut, was now weeping in front of his entire congregation, offering his prized possession to save the criminals who had exploited us all. He truly believed his wealthy image and his massive suburban house could buy his way out of federal wire fraud. He still thought he held the ultimate trump card. I picked up the heavy microphone from the acrylic podium. My voice was calm and steady, cutting through the frantic pleas of my father and the sobbing of my sister. "You do not own that house anymore, Dad." The words hit him like a physical blow. Malcolm froze, his hands dropping to his sides. He turned his head slowly to look at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of confusion and absolute dread. "What are you talking about?" he whispered, his voice barely carrying over the murmurs of the crowd. I clicked the small remote in my hand one final time. The projector screen behind me shifted from the hospital invoice to a new set of highly detailed financial documents. The bright white light washed over my father's face, illuminating his horror as he recognized the seal of his own bank. "I told you I am a senior audit director," I said, looking down at him from the stage. "And when I pull a financial thread, I pull it until the entire sweater unravels." Spencer did not just steal $250,000 from the church to cover his crypto margin calls. That was only the beginning of his debt. He needed a lot more cash to keep his fake empire afloat, and he knew exactly where to find it. I pointed to the massive screen behind me. The congregation followed my finger, reading the undeniable proof displayed in bold black letters. It was a commercial loan agreement. "Spencer secretly took out a massive second mortgage on your house, Dad." I explained the truth, landing like a sledgehammer in the silent ballroom. "He forged your signature and Mother's signature on the loan applications. He leveraged the entire $800,000 equity of your precious home and funneled that money directly into his failing cryptocurrency accounts." Sydney gasped from the floor where the agents were holding her. She looked up at Spencer, her tear-streaked face twisting in genuine shock. Spencer refused to look at her, keeping his eyes glued to his polished leather shoes. My father started shaking his head back and forth violently, denying the reality glowing right in front of him. "No, no, that is impossible," he stammered. "The bank would have notified me. I pay my mortgage every single month." "You pay your primary mortgage?" I corrected him. But Spencer intercepted the notices for the second mortgage. He has not made a single payment on that fraudulent loan in 6 months. And because the crypto market crashed again last week, his collateral was completely wiped out. I paused, letting the silence stretch out before delivering the final, ultimate checkmate. "The bank filed for foreclosure yesterday morning, Dad. The notices are already in the mail. You are going to be evicted by the end of the month." The reality of the words finally broke through his desperate denial. The house that represented his entire identity, the mansion where he hosted church dinners and boasted about his generational wealth, was gone. It had been stolen by the very white savior he had worshipped and protected. He had sold my kidney to protect a man who had secretly robbed him blind and left him entirely homeless. Malcolm let out a sound that I had never heard before. It was a guttural, hollow wail of a man who had just lost absolutely everything. His knees buckled beneath him. He collapsed onto the hardwood floor of the ballroom right at the base of the stage. He buried his face in his hands, sobbing uncontrollably into the polished wood, while the congregation he had led and lied to watched him fall from grace. Down at the head table, my mother Brenda was clutching the armrests of her wheelchair. The stolen diamonds around her neck could not hide the fact that she was now a homeless woman whose golden child was heading to federal prison. They had sacrificed me to maintain an illusion, and now they were left with nothing but the cold, unforgiving truth and empty bank accounts. The federal agents hauled Spencer and Sydney to their feet, roughly pulling them away from the wreckage of the shattered glass award. The cold reality of the metal handcuffs biting into their wrists instantly shattered whatever toxic alliance they had left. Spencer immediately started shouting that Sydney knew everything, that she had demanded the lavish lifestyle, and forced him to find the cash to keep up appearances. Sydney screamed back at him, her voice raw and hysterical, calling him a pathetic failure who lied about his wealth and ruined her perfect life. They thrashed and pulled against the agent's grips, but it was entirely useless. The tactical officers marched them forcefully down the center aisle of the ballroom. The golden couple was reduced to two weeping criminals, blaming each other for their own greed, as the congregation watched them being dragged out the main doors and into the flashing red and blue lights of the federal vehicles waiting outside in the humid night. With the primary thieves removed, the sheer fury of the crowd turned entirely toward the accomplices left behind. The ballroom erupted into a chaotic symphony of betrayal and righteous anger. Elderly women who had prayed for my mother were now pointing shaking fingers at her, shouting about their stolen Social Security checks and emptied pension funds. Men who had trusted my father began closing in around him, where he still kneeled on the hardwood floor, demanding he look them in the eyes and explain how he could sell out his own people for a white fraudster. The collective wrath of a community scorned is a terrifying force to witness. They had trusted Malcolm as a spiritual leader, and he had led them straight to the slaughterhouse, just to protect his fragile ego and his daughter's fake marriage. The senior pastor, who had been standing frozen near the edge of the stage, finally moved. His face was a mask of pure righteous indignation. He walked slowly over to my father, looking down at the weeping man curled into a pathetic ball on the floor. The room quieted just enough to hear the absolute disgust in the pastor's voice. Malcolm the pastor said, his words heavy and echoing through the tense air. "You have disgraced this congregation, and you have disgraced the house of God. You use the sacred pulpit to facilitate a robbery against the most vulnerable among us. I strip you of your title as elder immediately. You are no longer a leader here, and you are no longer welcome in our sanctuary. May God have mercy on your soul, because this community will not." The finality of the pastor's words was the ultimate death blow to my parents' fake empire. My father curled tighter into himself, a broken shell of a patriarch stripped of his title, his house, his golden child, and his dignity. I turned my gaze down to the head table where my mother Brenda was sitting perfectly still in her stylized wheelchair. She looked completely paralyzed by the devastation surrounding her. The heavy diamond tennis necklace rested against her collarbone like a physical manifestation of her own greed. She looked around the grand ballroom at the furious faces of her sorority sisters and the disgusted glares of her wealthy friends who were now turning their backs on her. She had absolutely nothing left. No sprawling suburban mansion to host her lavish dinners, no prestigious son-in-law to brag about at the country club. Her precious golden child was currently sitting in the back of a federal transport vehicle, facing years in a federal penitentiary. She had burned her entire life to the ground, just to maintain an illusion that was now completely reduced to ashes. Brenda's eyes slowly lifted from the floor and met mine across the room. I looked down at the woman who was currently breathing and living because my healthy kidney was functioning inside her body. She had willingly discarded the only daughter who had sacrificed her own flesh and blood to save her life. She had traded my genuine, unconditional love for a fake Rolex and a stolen boat. In that brief moment of eye contact, I saw the crushing, devastating realization wash over her. She knew she had made the worst trade in human history, and there was absolutely no way to reverse it. She opened her mouth to speak, to perhaps beg for my forgiveness, or plead for me to help them navigate the nightmare they had created, but no words came out. She was completely and utterly empty. I did not offer her a smile of pity or a scowl of hatred. I simply gave her a slow, deliberate nod, acknowledging the absolute finality of my victory. I reached down and smoothed the fabric of my tailored crimson blazer, making sure the buttons were perfectly aligned over my surgical dressing. My job here was completely finished. The audit was closed and the accounts were permanently settled. I stepped off the stage and walked down the center aisle. The angry congregation parted for me, stepping aside with a newfound quiet respect to let me pass. They knew I was not the angry black woman my family had painted me to be. I was the architect of their justice. I walked through the heavy wooden double doors of the ballroom, leaving the screaming, the crying, and the ashes of my parents' fake empire far behind me. I stepped out into the crisp Atlanta night air, taking a deep, clean breath. The dull ache in my side was still there, but it no longer felt like a wound of betrayal. It felt like a badge of absolute survival. 6 months have passed since that crisp Atlanta night when I walked out of the grand ballroom and left my toxic family to burn in the ashes of their own greed. The wheels of federal justice turn slowly, but when they finally grind forward, they crush everything in their path. I sat in the back row of a federal courtroom last week, watching the final sentencing. The arrogant smirk that Spencer used to wear was completely wiped from his face. He looked pale and exhausted, wearing a standard-issue prison uniform instead of his bespoke tuxedo. The judge did not buy his fake apologies or his attempts to blame his crypto brokers. Spencer was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison for wire fraud, charity fraud, and tax evasion. There will be no luxury boats or tailored suits where he is going, just concrete walls and a lot of time to think about the elderly church members he robbed. Sydney stood before the same judge, weeping uncontrollably and begging for leniency. She tried to play the victim, claiming she had no idea what her husband was doing, but the digital paper trail and her lavish spending habits proved otherwise. The judge saw right through her tears and sentenced my golden child sister to 3 years in a federal penitentiary for her active role in the conspiracy. She cried out for our mother as the bailiffs led her away, but Brenda could not save her this time. The white savior complex and the pristine social media aesthetic were officially dead and buried. My parents faced a completely different kind of prison. The bank finalized the foreclosure on their massive suburban mansion just weeks after the gala. The $800,000 house that my father prized above all else was auctioned off to the highest bidder. Malcolm and Brenda are now living in a tiny, run-down apartment on the far outskirts of the city. They have been completely ostracized by the church community and their wealthy friends. My father was officially excommunicated and stripped of all his titles. People cross the street when they see them walking to the grocery store. They have no money, no status, and no golden child to parade around. My mother still carries my healthy kidney inside her body, keeping her alive every single day. But she has to wake up every morning in a cramped apartment, knowing she traded the daughter who saved her for a fake diamond necklace and a handful of lies. I have not spoken a single word to them since I stepped off that stage, and I never will again. But destroying their fake empire was never my only goal. I am an auditor, and an auditor always balances the ledger. I worked closely with my contacts at the FBI and the IRS over the last 6 months to track down every single penny that Spencer stole. We liquidated the Delaware Shell Company and seized his remaining assets. I stood on the dock and watched the federal agents auction off that luxury speedboat, using the proceeds to replenish the stolen charity fund. I personally made sure that the restitution process was handled flawlessly. I visited the church and handed Sister Adams a certified check, replacing the pension money she had sacrificed. I watched the relief wash over the faces of the hard-working families as they received their savings back. They thanked me for stepping out of the shadows and fighting for them when their own elders had sold them out. I made my community whole again, and that brought me more peace than watching Spencer go to prison ever could. My own life looks entirely different now. The physical wound on my side is fully healed. The thick surgical dressing is gone, leaving behind a smooth silver scar that I trace with my fingers when I need a reminder of my own strength. It does not ache anymore. My corporate executives caught wind of my forensic investigation and how I handled the massive fraud case. They called me into the boardroom not to fire me for the bad press, but to offer me a massive promotion. I am now the vice president of auditing for the entire health insurance conglomerate. I sit in a corner office with floor-to-ceiling windows looking out over the Atlanta skyline, knowing that I built this life with my own brilliant mind and my own unbreakable will. I do not spend my holidays alone, and I do not mourn the family I left behind. I have built a chosen family of colleagues, friends, and community members who respect my boundaries and value my authentic self. We host dinners where no one has to pretend to be perfect, and love is never conditional. I finally have a home filled with genuine warmth and absolute peace. Blood does not make a family, loyalty and respect do. If your family demands you set yourself on fire just to keep their illusions warm, let them freeze. Have you ever had to walk away from your toxic family to save yourself? Let me know in the comments. Hit like and subscribe, and remember, your greatest revenge is your own unstoppable success.